Kia ora koutou. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this podcast about the 4-day working week and about alternative working patterns here in New Zealand. My name's John Bradbury. I work at the EMA as a People Experience Growth Advisor. And today I'm joined by three guests, all of whom bring unique perspectives and research in order to help us to understand alternative working patterns and the impact that they can have on your business. As we talk through today, there will be opportunities to join us on slido.com. On slido.com, you'll be able to raise questions and vote for questions that you would like us to deal with today. We will also be running some polls as we go through today to get your views on a number of the important issues. At the end of the podcast, at the webcast, we will share with you the resources that are referred to today, and in the next 24 hours, you'll get a recording of this webinar through your email. So thank you all very much for joining us. In terms of our guests today, I'm very pleased to have in the studio with me Andrew Barnes, who leads the 4-day work global movement. And he will be talking to us about the 4-day work movement and the research to date and what that shows. Also joining us, we have Jackie Maguire, organisational psychologist, whose podcast I really like personally. They base very much in evidence-based psychology and a strong focus on wellbeing at work. And finally, we also have Dr. Joan Nelson, who has a very interesting background in terms of leadership and the leading some refugees from Afghanistan, which is very well worth having a look at. But she has been very much focused around a new movement about work school hours. So we'll be talking to Dr. Ellen about that during this webcast too. So that's the sort of lay of the land today. We've got quite a lot we know people want us to cover, and I guess quite a limited time to do that. So maybe first of all, I'll ask Andrew, who's in the studio with me, to introduce himself and talk a little bit about the 4-day work movement.
All right, thanks, John. Look, I'm Andrew Barnes. I'm the founder of Perpetual Guardian and also 4-day week global. Now, way back in 2018, Perpetual Guardian moved to a 4-day week. We ran a trial, and what I found from that is our business became far more productive. And the whole thesis that we were looking at was this point of how do you improve productivity in a business? And that's really the journey that we started on, John. Not about work-life balance. How do we make our company more profitable and more productive?
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Andrew. That's really interesting to hear. So, Ellen, tell us a little bit about the work school hours movement and what led you to that and what that's about.
Yeah, sure. So my background was in the New Zealand Army, and I did a PhD around the experiences of women in the workforce, followed by a kind of an accidental postdoctoral piece of research about the experiences of working parents. And so my starting point for #work school hours was to deal with the societal-wide challenge that parents were having in the workplace. But what I get excited about is I've got a business background, and I'd like to sort of complement what Andrew just said, is I believe that alternative ways of working are commercially smart. So yes, I want to address social challenges, but actually doing so will bring about commercial gains. So that's what I'm trying to push is work school hours. So thanks.
Oh, thanks very much, Ellen. That's a really nice introduction, and clearly you're both focused very much on productivity. So Jackie, in terms of these alternative working patterns, both the ones we're hearing about today, but other ones that have been tried in New Zealand, give us your perspective on those, please.
Yeah, thanks. Kia ora koutou, everyone. I'm Jackie Maguire. I'm a registered clinical psychologist, but I work with organisations. So I'm a fish out of water in terms of normally it's the organisational psychologist in that space. My work is very heavily based both with New Zealand and some international companies, really around how do we support wellbeing and mental health to have, sustainable, high-performing, satisfied people, teams, businesses. So like Andrew, like Ellen, I too come from a lens that I passionately believe, and the research is very clear, that if your people are well, if your teams are functional, if people support each other, if your leaders lead well, then the benefit of high wellbeing, high mental health, is that your people are more onto it, is that your performance will improve, is that you will hold retention of your staff. And so, you know, I work really closely with exec teams, with boards, and throughout organisations doing that training, psycho education, practical bits around how do we actually think about the new ways that we are needing to work, hybrid work, flexible work, given the psychological pressures that have been happening over the last 2.5 years. And also, what does that mean going forward, knowing we've got some economic difficulties coming up, we've got labour shortages, etc.
Great, thanks very much. Thanks. Good to hear all your voices in the room and to hear those introductions. And you know, we very much hear from our members around these challenges around productivity, around well-being, around recruitment, around retention. And I really want to make sure we get the voice of everyone listening into the room. So we do have a couple of polls that we want to get open now for people to answer. So you'll find there's two polls there. And if you can now go into Slido and answer the questions there, that would be terrific. So you need to go to Slido, you go to the hashtag 4days, and then you'll be able to answer those polls. Also do come up with your questions as well for the panel. So maybe if I come back to you, Andrew, and you know, you've really put us in the spotlight around productivity, and that being the driving force for the 4-day work movement. Tell us a bit more about that.
Well, John, my journey started with something very simple. There was a piece of British research that showed that the Brits were only productive for 2.5 hours a day. And anybody feeling very smug about that, the Canadians are actually only productive in the same survey for 1.5 hours a day. And that was the thing that got me on the journey, because I wondered what was stopping productivity. And if I asked my people to do something different, could I actually enhance productivity? So the idea was, I said, if you could find a way to work more efficiently, I would gift you a day off a week in order that, you know, you can, you do all the other things that you want. And that was the incentive to say to people, you know, that's the driver that we should use. Now, if you think about it, if you are only productive for 3 hours a day, you only have to find 45 minutes of additional productivity in each of 4 days in order to be as productive in 4 days as you were in 5. And the evidence suggests that we're capable of doing it. When we did that in Perpetual Guardian, we found our productivity went up 25% overall. And we call this rule the 100-80-100 rule. 100% pay, 80% time, provided we get 100% productivity. So it's very clear. It's not about working less to deliver less. It's working less to deliver the same or more.
Right. Okay. So very clear sort of focus on productivity, and I understand that. Ellen, how does that sort of tie in with your research around working school hours?
Yeah, really similarly. To be honest, I regularly quote the amazing work of Andrew with the 4-day week, which is absolutely proving there is evidence to show that you can get the same amount of work done in less time. And for me, with my research, the working parents that I interviewed who are working part-time, so many on, say, 25, 30-hour contracts, which is pretty similar to Andrew's 32-hour week, they're still delivering the same amount of outputs as their full-time colleagues. So my argument is, well, why don't we just pay them to do their full outputs? They will get their full outputs done. They'll just do it in less hours, and it's a win for everybody.
Very good. So very much supporting and reinforcing those points. But, you know, I think a lot of people taking a perspective of being a worker or an employee might say, OK, this focus on productivity and working harder, what's that going to mean in terms of my well-being? What's that going to mean for me in the longer term? And employers are probably thinking about that too. What would you have to say on that, Jackie?
I think I'd have to say I don't believe there is ever a golden bullet in life that will take us through. And so I think the 4-day week, or looking at hybrid work or flexible work, they're all tools that are available to an organisation. I suppose for me, though, it's how are those tools implemented? How do the leaders and the business wrap around that to support it? So what do we know right now? We know in 2022 that burnout is on the rise from the pandemic, from inflation, from low resource. We know that for many people, they're double, triple, quadruple hatting. They're carrying a lot of load in terms of excessive workload. And you can't continue to tell your staff, don't worry, we'll manage it, we'll continue to get resource over time. Like, people will tune out to that. And so for me, it is a 4-day work week may work for your team. Hybrid working may work for your people. But are you looking at the other elements that contribute to workplace wellbeing? And when you look at the research around the factors that impact that, for example, is, do your people have autonomy and control around how they manage their work during that time, for example? How well are leaders communicating? And what I say to teams is, do your people feel seen, heard, and understood? At a core level, you've got to be seen by your leader. Is it things like you've got supportive team environments? So I might only be working 4 days a week, but if my team is toxic, if we've got unethical behavior going on, if we don't have good diversity in the team, etc., all of that stuff will impact. And if I don't feel psychologically safe, if I don't feel supported, if I don't feel like my needs are seen, doesn't matter how much I'm working, the how I'm working or the environment I'm working in will impact me and therefore the productivity. So I'm not saying it doesn't work. The evidence is very clear. Wellbeing can improve, performance can improve, but I would say what's wrapping around that tool to help make it successful.
If I could jump in on that, John, because I absolutely agree with that. And a little bit of what we're trying to do when we implement a 4-day week, we do it from the bottom up. We don't do it from top down. So what you've got to do is you've got to say to your individual staff members, what is it that you would do differently? And if you can do things differently, you've got the accountability and responsibility. And it's not just accountability and responsibility to me, it's accountability and responsibility to your colleagues, because what you've got to do is not waste your time, but also not waste their time. So a lot of the things that Jackie is talking about are the underpinnings of our approach. But I totally agree with her. You're not going to solve this. This will not work if you've got a toxic culture. You actually have to have a culture of high trust. But if you do implement it, and hopefully I could just pull up one of the slides here, if we bring those up, yeah. So what we did here was, this is the results from Perpetual Guardians trial in 2018. And you can see that when we implemented it, leadership, commitment, stimulation, empowerment, those scores all went up. Team cohesion scores went up, because what we're doing is you're creating an environment where you are getting that support that Jackie was talking about. It isn't a top-down, this is what you're going to do. And so it very much is about, creating that culture where people are supporting each other and working together.
Very interesting. So certainly that piece about the sort of wider sort of organisational culture and leadership in there. And I noticed you were sort of nodding to that, Ellen. Could you expand on that too?
Yeah, sure. I mean, my real kind of core expertise is around leadership. So I see this, work full hours as almost just kind of one part of that. So I really agree with Jackie. Yeah, cool, change your hours. That doesn't solve your whole work problems. You've got to make sure that people are all the things that Jackie and Andrew have just talked about. So I really do agree. My kind of core is around leadership. And when you lead people and get the best out of them, looking at the hours that they work is just one part of that. There's a whole lot more to get the best out of people.
Right.
And can I jump back in just to say, in terms of Andrew, how he did that, we're from the ground up. I think part of that is leaders getting out and speaking to as many people in their organisation as possible around what are their challenges, what do they think would be helpful for them. Because often as leaders, we presume we know the answers, but we're often wrong. Actually, the staff will have a lot of the answers, your people. And so, if you open a textbook, they'd call that a listening tour. Get out and listen, use 2 ears and 1 mouth, and report back what you've heard to show people that you've seen, heard, and understood them. The second part, I think, is we don't have a blueprint for this, how we are going to live and work going forward. There is a new normal, and none of us actually know what this sustainably will look like. And so I'm a scientist, I'm a geek at heart, and I think we have to take an experimentation approach, which, Andrew, it sounds like that's exactly, I know that's what you did at Perpetual Guardian. You put it in place, you put a timeline around it, you get your data, you ask people, and you come back to review. So I think that's really important. Just because you put in an initiative doesn't mean it always has to be that way. Experiment and work out what fits with your people.
No, absolutely.
You looked, I wanted to say some more.
No, absolutely. I just totally agree with that. And I think this is the point. It is an experiment.
Yes.
And what works for me may not necessarily work for you. And, we talk a lot about the 4-day week, but again, this is where Ellen and I cross paths, I think, in that some of my staff work 5 days a week, but they work school hours because they want to walk their kids to school. I have other people who take 2 afternoons off a week because that's what they're looking for. The key is you've got to give people the time off that is important to them, because that's the motivator. So what we're really talking about is reducing hours. The 4-day week's a bit of clickbait and everybody can understand it, but the reality is 80% time, the 180-100 rule.
Right, so you're taking us back to the sort of productivity piece again and driving that, and also sort of reinforcing that bit about looking for what works in terms of working hours for the individual, which may be working school hours, maybe hybrid working, maybe a 4-day working week.
I'm so glad you said that, Andrew, because new research has come through which shows productivity peaks in the day, and through COVID and working from home and hybrid working, they're showing that actually there's now a third peak. There's normally 2 peaks of productivity during the day. And the research is coming out that there's now a third for people, which is between about 7 to 9 or 8 to 10 at night. And I think historically it's been this like, you shouldn't be working after hours. It's absolutely no go. France had the right to disconnect. And I'm not here advocating that you should work till 10 o'clock at night every night. But I do think that comes back to giving autonomy. Some people would like to go for coffee, go to the gym, spend the afternoon with their kids, and they're very happy and willing to sign back on after dinner and make up, and do their time there. And so I think that is about respecting, trusting, and handing over the autonomy to your people to make good decisions for themselves, which is different, I think, to how it's been thought about in the past.
Yeah. Ellen, do you have anything to add to that from your research?
Yeah, I think we're quite in support of each other, really. So, when I talk about hashtag work school hours, similarly to Andrew, it's kind of a bit of a catchy phrase, right? I'm not saying every workplace must work between 9 and 3. That's not actually realistic. It's about how do you focus on the outputs that you want staff to deliver as opposed to caring so much about their hours. How do you give people flexibility and autonomy? Exactly what Andrew said. Work school hours is not just this thing for parents, it's for everybody. So yeah, okay, the parents might want to work literally within the school hours, but you might have someone else who wants to do 4 days, or someone else who wants to have the afternoons off, or as Jackie's just said, and I love it because I'm actually a night owl, is they might want to do other stuff during the day and do work at night. It's really about empowering people to do the tasks that you've employed them to do and giving them far more autonomy and control over when and where and how they actually do that. So yeah, definitely agree with those points.
The piece here that's complex, and I think we need to acknowledge the complexity, is that work is not just an individual task. So work is about coming together, innovating, collaboration, sharing skills, and that's part of the big challenge, I think, at the moment with hybrid working, for example, those that are in office-based jobs, is when do we come in together, when do we not, what tasks do we do together, what tasks do we do at home? And so I think leaders have a particularly challenging task, and it's important to acknowledge that, where you almost schedule maestros around how you've got all these people in your team and they've got all their preferences around how they work, and then how do you make that work from a team perspective, or when do you come together to do bits for the team, when can you do the bits on your own? And I think that is part of the complexity of leadership now that we have to be aware of and manage.
Thanks very much, Jackie. That's great. I just want to kind of reflect into the room what the audience is thinking about this, and we have a result from a first poll, which was around where we asked people, is your business considering a 4-day work week? And what we've got there is 20% of people are saying yes. 39% of people are saying maybe, so not sure at the moment, and 41% are saying no. So with those sort of response in mind, I thought maybe we'd pick on the sort of top question from Slido as well, which seems to be the concern about how to best measure productivity. Andrew, you look amused by that.
I do. Look, it really does. This is the question that comes up all the time, right? So let's think about this. How do you measure productivity is the question. Well, how are you measuring productivity? Nothing's changed here. If you aren't measuring productivity, or you don't know how to measure productivity, you are using time as a surrogate for productivity. So, you know, nothing changes here. Now, okay, I have a service industry, so it was a problem for us. But what we did is we went to the team and we said, look, how should we measure you? How should we determine that we're getting this 100% productivity? And there was a reason for doing that. Part of that was actually to give ourselves new measurements. The other part of it, quite critically, was that the individual was determining what they shouldn't be doing as well as what they should be doing. And often it's the what you shouldn't be doing that's important. So there's a classic piece of research out of Microsoft in Japan, which is this thing where they said, right, no more than 5 people in a meeting, no meeting more than half an hour, please use Microsoft Teams. And they got a 39.9% improvement in productivity because they stopped doing the stuff that wasn't productive and they did the stuff that was productive. And then there are other, you know, great ones about the fact that statistically you get interrupted once every 11 minutes in an open plan office, and it takes you 22 minutes to get back to full productivity. So if you have a quiet hour where you can't be interrupted, a deep work, if you will, that's the equivalent of 3 hours of normal productivity. There's your improvement in productivity right there.
Right.
So it's rethinking how you do work.
Yeah.
Is at the heart of this. But actually time is lazy. That's what we all do,
Right.
rather than working on output. Okay,
so it sounds like you're talking about working back from measuring productivity in terms of outputs, and then looking at kind of what gets in the way of that. What's your kind of take on that, Ellen? Have you found that to be the case in your research too?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's not kind of, I mean, I think Jackie used the term no silver bullet for all of this, right? Every organization is different. Every role, every situation is different. There's not sort of some magic answer that applies universally. But I agree with Andrew very much. When people say, oh, I don't have time to measure productivity, how could I do this? I'm like, well, how the heck are you not doing that already in your business? You're paying staff for their hours without actually knowing what it is that they're producing for you. That feels odd. And I think at the point that you employ a staff member to come into your organization, at that point, it's actually very clear what it is that you want them to do. You think, okay, we cannot manage all of our tasks with our current staffing. We're going to need to get a new person to do tasks X, Y, and Z. And then when they start, we almost forget about the fact that we employed them to do task X, Y, and Z. We then have a conversation about remuneration, which is like, were you at the premise for these hours on these days of the week, which is kind of irrelevant to the tasks. And the other thing I'd say is a lot of this, the kind of default mindset goes to office workers, right? So when I talk about this, you're sort of thinking office workers, knowledge workers. And yes, that is the most kind of easy to get your head around place to apply this. But I've also worked with people in the construction sector, in manufacturing, in the primary sector, people who are actually also adopting these principles and getting increases in outputs from staff.
That's really interesting, because obviously some skepticism I've heard has been around, well, this is all very well in sort of more office-based jobs, knowledge workers, but how can this apply in other industries as well, particularly say manufacturing?
Yeah.
What sort of experience do you have there?
Well, I mean, let's pick a very unproductive company in the world. I don't know, Volkswagen. Volkswagen manufactures cars on a 28-hour week. Panasonic manufactures electronics on a 4-day week. We've got, and I agree with Ellen, we've got construction companies, we've got agricultural, we've got healthcare, we've got, you know, wherever you are in the world, the general reaction to this often is people look at you when you're talking, they look away into the middle distance, then they come back and they try and pick an industry that will prove that it won't work. And I can tell you that somewhere in the world, there is a company in that sector doing the 4-day week. I was asked this question in New Zealand about 3 weeks ago, and they said it wouldn't work in a fish and chip shop. Well, guess what? There's a fish and chip shop in Suffolk in the United Kingdom doing the UK trial as we speak.
Marvelous. Thanks very much, Andrew. So you have the proof points and you'll search them out wherever they are. I think on the productivity side, I just want to address one of the other questions that's on slide, and I was going to turn to you, Jackie, on this one, because it talks about sort of accepting that there might be productivity gains initially in the short term, but how do you make sure those productivity gains are sustained and carry on? I'm sure you'd have a view on that.
Yeah, well, I suppose I go, what are the productivity killers, right? And for me, that's presenteeism, right? Where my body is in the building, or my body's at my computer or on my building site, but my brain is working at less than 50% capacity. That's the definition of presenteeism. The research says it costs us 3 times the amount as absenteeism. You better go off and have a rest and come back and be on when you're on, rather than muddling along at half pace. And then you think, well, what are the things that contribute to that? There are all those factors, like I'm burnt out, I've got too much load. Actually, I don't have good support in my team. I don't feel safe at work. I can't be myself. I can't speak out. I can't do my job because I'm so fearful of retribution, punishment, shame, being excluded, not being given opportunities, that I'm on edge and my fight or flight system is running, and that drains my energy. So how much cognitive capacity do I then have to be on? And so, I think that really does come back to, if you implement a tool after consulting, I love, again, Andrew saying we went to the staff and we said, how do we measure you? That's a collaborative process. You get good results when people feel like they are part of decision making. So if we've gone through that process, we've set something up, how do we then continue to monitor wellbeing, to have wellbeing conversations, to check in with people about what's going well for you, what are your challenges at the moment, do you think this is working, for you, and how do we keep that going over time? When you look at some of the research, it says the barriers to a 4-day working is when the workload stays too high, in terms of if you keep slamming people, doesn't matter how well resilient they are, if you slam people continuously, they'll struggle. But also intensification, which means that if I'm so intensely working that we miss out on social collegiality time, etc., because we're working a condensed week, then we lose our creativity, our innovation, people ruminate more after work, etc. So I think it is about really that continual working alongside your team. Is this working? How's it working? What do you need from a holistic mental health and wellbeing perspective? And that's how you keep your productivity high. And what you need to be doing might shift and change over time. Your staff are fluid. They change. They've got different things going on in their life. The world changes in terms of what our requirements are. And so I don't think anything is static. And so that's what I would say is important. Keep talking, keep listening, keep experimenting.
Yeah, and I think there's also an additional point on that, and it is one of these questions about legislative change, because some people talk about a legislative change. So, for example, when France introduced the 35-hour week, they got a short-term spike in productivity, and then over time, people's behavior defaulted back to the way it was before. So how we've dealt with that at PG is quite simply, our contracts of employment don't change. We are 5-day, 39-hour contracts. I have staff members who sign up annually, and they sign up to go into the 4-day week policy, productivity policy, we call it. Now, if productivity isn't maintained, we have the right to say, come back to 5 days. Now, I've only ever had to exercise that once in 4 years. And that's the whole point about this. It's about personal responsibility, personal accountability, and that's what keeps it fresh.
Okay, so I'm hearing a lot about personal responsibility, team relationships, culture in the organisation. All these things helping to make sure that when you change to whatever your change is to, hybrid 4-day work, hashtag work school hours, that you make sure that those are effective. Can
I add something, John? Sorry, can I butt in? Sorry. I just also saw that in the list of questions, there was a question around professional services and industries that, for example, charge in 6-minute blocks. Right? How does this work if that's how our system operates? And I suppose I'd say just because it's always been that way doesn't mean that it forever has to be that way in the future. And so maybe that's coming together and going, what would it be like if we charged for the piece of work rather than how much time it took for the piece of work? Like, let's put a price on the outcome, and then, you know, and then we are productive in it rather than ensuring we're clocking up 6-minute slots. And so I think that comes back to round the table conversations around how are we operating, how are we working, how are we interacting with our clients, how are we achieving our outcomes? Is there a different way of doing that?
Great, thank you very much. There's some very practical, sort of pragmatic questions coming through as well, which are around thinking about employment agreements and sort of what constitutes the working week and public holidays and sick leave. So Ellen, how do you suggest organisations sort of handle it? How have organisations navigated that you've worked with? Perhaps Andrew, could you talk to that?
Yeah, look, I mean, this is a real problem. So in New Zealand, Employment Relations Act and the Holidays Act are not fit for purpose because they focus on normal hours of work, normal days of work, normal place of work. So how we got round it is we don't change our employment contracts. I think I said that earlier. We keep them as they are. You then opt in to the productivity policy, and that means that you are effectively saying that they acknowledge that I will gift you 40 days off a year, and in return for that, you will make sure that you're delivering the same output. That's the deal.
Yeah.
Now, the only downside of that is the Holidays Act. So with the Holidays Act, because I haven't changed my original hours in the contract, I have to accrue leave as if you were working 5 days a week, which basically means I'm accruing 4 days leave on the 40 days I gift off. So what we then do is we say to people, if you opt into the policy, you have to commit to give 1 day a quarter to charity or community service. Now, I'm still paying for it, but for me, this is an important part of paying it forward, if you will. I am gifting you something very valuable, more time to do the things that you want to do. In return, because I want you to be the best you can be in the office, I want you to be the best you can be outside the office. There's a responsibility to gift some of that back to your community and society. So, I can't get away from accruing it.
Yes.
Which is the amendment we'd like to see the government make. But actually, on the other hand, it's quite an important part of the whole programme.
Absolutely. Thank you for giving that context, and also again sort of emphasising that what seems to be a kind of quid pro quo within this and discussion. Ellen, we just lost you for a moment there, and I just thought I'd ask you perhaps the next question if you're able to join us again, which is really around what's been the sort of response of people where perhaps for some people in an organisation they want to work school hours and move to that sort of alternative work arrangement, and other people don't want to. How have employers navigated that? I think again perhaps we've not got you, Ellen. Jackie, do you have a view on that?
I suppose for me, I come from an organisational justice perspective, which I know that perceived fairness is really important in terms of mental health and wellbeing at work. So giving people the option and enabling them to opt in is fair, right? We've all had the same opportunity provided to us. Whether we take that up or how we navigate that for ourselves is in our individual decision. I think also when it comes to the practical nuts and bolts of implementing these systems, like, I'm not the expert in that, and I will admit that, but I think when we come up with ways of working, plans, experiments, what is important is the process of how you do that. And for me, that stays consistent across everything. Are we asking openly? Are we coming in as curious inquirers rather than deciding that we've already got the answer? Do we consult where we need to get in expertise that's outside of our own field? And if we can continue through that process, then I think you've got a good process running to bring people along with you. But organisational justice, perceived fairness is really important to organisational wellbeing.
And I would agree with that. I mean, the key point here is I don't mind whether you work 5 days or 4 days. That's your choice. And frankly, there are some people, about 15% of our company at any point in time will be working 5 days. Now, that's either because you've just come into the organization and we make you work 5 days just so you can demonstrate what a 5-day task is, and then you move to 4 days. But equally, we have a bunch of people who want to work 5 days a week. Now, they're not being disadvantaged because they're being paid for output. So it all ties together, but you can't force people into a particular pathway, I think.
Thanks very much on that. I mean, there's a very practical question that's gone to the top here, Andrew, which is about who's taking up the sort of 4-day work week so far. Is that sort of information that's can be in the public domain?
It is some of it is in the public domain. So our New Zealand trial has just started. Some of those companies have actually said that they want to share that. Some of them have said not. So yes, it is in the public domain. What is probably more appropriate is we've engaged with, I think, over 10,000 companies worldwide now who are actually implementing things like the 4-day week. And in fact, it's quite high percentages. In other countries, we're very slow here. But in Japan now, they're reckoning about 8% of companies are operating on a 4-day week.
Fantastic. So it sounds like there's New Zealand examples. If you're looking for your particular sector, you can look globally if you can't see one in New Zealand. So to look for examples that are meaningful.
And go to the 4-day week website, and that'll sort of give you some of that information.
Great, very good. Thank you very much. We've been running a sort of a second poll, which looked at people that were interested in the 4-day week, you know, I'd sort of expand that to be thinking about any sort of alternative sort of working patterns that there are, and thinking about the rationale for that. What we're saying today, in terms of the results, is quite a strong focus on staff well-being as being a reason to be interested. Jackie, what's your reaction to that?
Good. Now let's put our monies where our mouth is, you know, and do it and support people. You know, I mean, I support organisations, public and private sector, large businesses, SMEs. You know, I've worked with Microsoft. I've worked with a 12-person recruiting company. You know, for me, the importance is that if your company or your organisation is interested in staff wellbeing, really make a commitment to it and know that you're doing that because it will benefit your business as well as your people. And I think that comes back to really good leadership training. Like if you look at our Health and Safety at Work Act now, mental health, wellbeing, we have a duty of care as leaders in organisations to support people's wellbeing and mental health. But I think what's often happened is that legislations come in. We now know that we need to care for mental health and wellbeing, and leaders aren't psychologists. Leaders haven't gone and done a degree for that. You know, you have boards and exec teams that may have been promoted on their technical skill rather than their people leadership skill. And so it's like, actually, we need to be backing and supporting businesses, leaders, teams to care for staff wellbeing, you know, properly, effectively, sustainably. And I think having to look at the way we're working, how we're working, you know, is just as important as where and when we're working.
Thanks, Jackie. Ellen, it looks like you're able to join us again. And just in terms of that sort of poll result that indicated that, you know, the big interest was really around staff wellbeing. Is that something that you find is a big driver for organisations?
Yeah, absolutely. And sorry, I don't know what my technical issues were, but yeah, when I said at the start, like my expertise is around the leadership space. I use this model where I talk about there's 3 things that leaders need to create for their people to excel. And the first one is around giving staff a sense of control and autonomy, which is kind of, I guess, the topic of this conversation. The second one is around they need to feel that what they does matters. But the third one is that staff need to feel that they belong. And when we talk about well-being, that really encompasses all of those 3 things. So when staff feel well, when they feel happy, and when they feel like they belong, as Jackie said as well, we all know this, they perform at their best. Like there was sort of this old adage of, oh, I don't pay my staff to be happy, I pay them to do their job. Well, actually the 2 are correlated. And if you all think about the times when you performed the best in your life, it's when you felt great. You know, we like to think of ourselves as, you know, some thinking creatures who do some pesky feelings every now and again. Actually, we are feelings-based creatures who sometimes do some thinking. So when staff feel their best, when their well-being is best, not only is that great for the people, which is the bit that's kind of at my heart, I want to make the world better for people, it's commercially smart. It's just this kind of wonderful, fulfilling cycle. So yes, I'm really happy to see that well-being is a real motivator for this.
Really happy, and I suppose now, Andrew, you were laughing at that.
Well,
too.
I mean, look, I have a background in the military as well. I mean, we always had the adage, a good ship is a happy ship, right? I mean, it is. If your environment is good, let's go out on a limb here. You know, happy, healthy, well motivated, well rested staff are more productive. No shit. I mean,
Exactly. It's not rocket science.
It is not.
So here we are with some groundbreaking research, I think. Thanks for sharing that. Just take another perspective on leadership in this, you know, in terms of sort of making the change and taking the rest of your executive team with you, if you feel this is the way to go. What sort of experiences have you had around that? And what sort of recommendations do you have, Andrew?
The people who hate this the most are your leadership team. I mean, frankly, my board, my senior leadership team, my middle management all thought I was completely mad. Dealt with the board by announcing it first on national television. That solved that particular problem. They weren't claimed to block it. And the senior leadership team, I made it mandatory for them to do it. And then for the middle management, you said, look, you know, the idea here is I'm not holding you responsible if it doesn't work, but I'm holding you accountable to give it a chance. And what we found very quickly is suddenly leaders realized that, one, their teams were more effective, but what was also critical is it made them better leaders, because then they had to start to think about leadership and less about management. And you know, I found that was a really interesting dynamic. But you know, we are all conditioned that working longer, working harder is the benchmark. And actually, shouldn't it be about working smarter?
Very good, very interesting. So we sort of come back to some pretty key themes around the organisational workplace and the culture there, but also that there we're now focusing on leadership at various levels in the organisation. Tell us, Ellen, how do you sort of navigate that with organisations? Because I know you're very passionate and experienced around leadership. Tell us your sort of advice around this.
Well, I think the big thing is people work best when they believe in it themselves. So, you know, I can push this idea of work school hours and looking at different ways of working. If leaders don't want to pick it up, then really I'm not going to force them to do it, right? But if you can educate people to understand why there's some benefits to them of doing it, they're far more likely to do it. And so when you think about, the honest truth is all of us are effectively inherently selfish. Yes, we do lovely selfless things, but we are all motivated by what's good for us. So when you think about what are the barriers for leaders, and I love what Andrew just said then, leaders are fearful of doing these things because they're like, well, what if it fails? And then that reflects really badly on me as a leader. And what if I don't then deliver the outputs? If you take some of that away and say, look, leaders, it's okay if this doesn't work first time. What we want you to do is give it a go. We're not going to slam you if it doesn't work. Just like Andrew said, that's a massive way to, I think, alleviate this hurdle. The other thing is when we're talking about it from the bottom up, because I say the same thing as Andrew, is you go to your people and say, how can we do this? Leaders are then blown away by the creativity of their staff and the capability of their staff that perhaps they never really had the opportunity to unleash. So I see this really as an opportunity for improving leaders and making their lives easier.
Very good, very interesting. Look, Jackie, there's a question that sort of popped up here that's really seems to be on people's mind about, you know, what I'd call sort of resilience fatigue in terms of where people are now. People are very busy, people are very stressed, reorganisations are perhaps understaffed, and now, you know, fairly crudely, we're asking people to do the same in less time, or maybe to do more in less time. But, you know, how do you suggest leaders kind of handle that?
How long have we got? I think it's interesting versus, you know, just quickly on that leadership versus management conversation, and that's something I speak about with leaders a lot. And, you know, for example, there are large companies like a telco in Australia that has split that role internally. So you now have leaders that are responsible for, you know, development, goals, you know, care, etc. And then you have output project managers. And that's a very useful way of showing that there's leadership pathways in the business that aren't just about people management, and really splitting out those tasks. But from a resilience perspective, I suppose being really honest with you, that's a word I don't use anymore. I used to run a company with resilience in the title, but for me, the word resilience very much is a finger point of you just need to be stronger. So no matter what comes your way, be tougher, be stronger, bounce back. And I think there are times where, you know, resilience is useful, resilience of a building in an earthquake, but I actually think this is about people being well. And when we're well and we have good mental health, we flourish, we operate well, we manage stresses, we perform, we have good relationships, etc. And when you look at organizational well-being, it's multifactored. So, you know, to help support our people, yes, you have to have individual skills. Your people need to have good ability to recognize what triggers their stress. They need to know how to manage that. We need to support people to manage their thinking, etc. But that is one part of organizational well-being. And I use the model called IGLOO, which is you've got to have individual supports in place. Your teams or your group, the G, has to be well. And when you come to the crux of that, that is about psychological safety and peer support, which is, can we trust each other, have each other's backs, etc. The L is your leadership behavior. How well do your leaders role model and talk the talk? How much do they get to know who you are as a person? You know, how do they help support that psychological safety? Like, we've got consistent ways to ask for, you know, to ask for feedback, to respond to your ideas. And the O is the organizational policies and structures in place. And so if I look at that model and say, how do we support the burnout, the fatigue, the tiredness, because it is real. It's a long, well-known side effect of psychological crisis. And I think we've been in that for 2.5 years. You know, I think that has to be senior leadership teams looking at that map, because they are the only people that sit across all four of those things. They're an individual themselves. They influence the group, the leadership, and the organization as a whole, saying, what are our, you know, do a SWOT analysis. What are your strengths and weaknesses across those things? You know, what would be most beneficial for the organization, and really going, we've got to support people holistically. As an interesting aside, the Great Resignation in the States, where 8% of the workforce left their roles in the last quarter of last year, MIT Sloan have come out saying that toxic culture was the #1 driver of that Great Resignation. So it's things like, you know, you've got your basics in place, have you got staff that support each other, that are inclusive, etc. That, I think, will help the burnout, help the fatigue.
Great. So it sounds like there's a wealth of research that you're referencing there that people can think about and use to think about how to best manage through that. There's a very sort of practical question that's sort of come up, obviously of interest to people, and I think it'd be worth sort of focusing in on it, because what we're saying, what the question is about how to manage this for a business that wants to stay open, use your working hours, keep the business open for 5 days with the sort of flexible arrangements. So I guess I'm particularly interested to hear from you, Andrew, and then maybe you, Ellen, on that.
Well, I mean, we don't close. I've got 17 retail stores around New Zealand. I have to stay open 5 days. Volkswagen manufacture cars 7 days a week. Now, bizarrely, if you were 7 days a week, you're already working shifts. All this is really talking about is rejigging shifts. When you are operating 5 days a week, you have to, it's equivalent to rejigging shifts. So you've got people working less hours, but your business stays open. Now, one of the great examples here, though, practical examples, is an accountancy firm in Western Australia went to a 4-day week, rejigged how it handled the customers, got teams rather than individual accountants, moved their business to 7 days a week. This actually creates an opportunity. And as Jackie said, where people want to work in the evening, if you really are creative, you may find that you can actually expand your working hours with people actually working less time.
Right.
It's rethinking what you do, not being constrained by this concept that working is 9 to 5 days a week.
Right. Okay. So I very much get that it's, you know, we're not talking necessarily about we're moving for 5 days, to 4 days, and therefore 1 day nobody's working. We're actually talking about, we're looking at how the business can most effectively operate to be productive, and actually maybe even finding opportunities in that to expand the hours that are offered.
80% of the time. It is not about closing your business.
Thanks very much. That's very good. Ellen, how do you deal with that sort of question when people say, well, my goodness, if people are working school hours, how are our customers going to be served in those times?
Yeah, so really similar answer to Andrew, and I'll just share a couple of examples. So, you know, people, when you put ideas out into the world, right, people love to be like, I found this one example where it won't work, so your whole idea is crap. And the example I get, well, you know, well, what about hospitals? You know, we're not going to close hospitals at 3 o'clock. Well, no, of course not. I'm not an idiot. Of course, hospitals are going to stay open after 3 o'clock. But it's around work school hours. Again, it's very similar principles to 4-day week. But for me, the starting motivator is how do we do more to align the schedules of adults and children? And so I had a nurse who said to me that she could do two night shifts a week. So this is not school hours, it's 2 night shifts per week. But the hospital said, no, we've got a minimum 3 shift policy. And so they lost her. I had another example of a shift worker who said, could they move their shift to the right by 2 hours so that they could do one of the school runs? And the boss said no, and so they lost that person. So it's really around, you still operate when you operate, but how do you let your staff within that have more flexibility and autonomy so that you actually retain those staff? Yeah.
Very good. So it's very interesting. Yeah. So about another tool to retain staff, another tool to keep good staff working for you and being effective. There's clearly a few questions people have got around the whole sort of demotivating aspect for people who in some way, perhaps because they already work part-time, or perhaps they feel that they can't do the 4-day work week, they might be excluded from it. How do they, you know, how do you deal with that sort of demotivation?
Well, look, first, yeah, Ellen, you take it. Go.
Well, it's funny, like this is something that's to benefit everyone. So it's not a case, and for mine, you know, kind of my starting point's parents, but it's not at the expense of people that are not parents. It's this thing that benefits everyone. So I can't really understand how a person could feel that they're missing out in this instance. And I'm pretty sure Andrew would say the same thing, right? He even said if people don't want to work 4 days, well, it's cool. They can keep working 5 if they want to. It's not a case of you sign up or you miss out. It's, yeah. And just sorry, I just wanted to say one other point, if you will. This is around the productivity, in terms of how do people get more done in less time. And it was pointed to Jackie's question before about resilience. And this is where my research data, which led to work school hours, which was working parents, and the truth is it was majority mums that I interviewed, they were already doing it, right? So every single, I say parent, but it is mostly mums who's on a part-time contract, who's doing 25 or 30 hours, they are already doing this amount. They're just getting ripped off and not getting paid for their full outputs. So I want to change that.
I totally agree with that. And one of the things we did when we went to the 4-day policy, bizarrely, my head of HR had done exactly that, you know, negotiate an 80% contract, 80 salary and hours, but was delivering 100%. So we put the salaries up, because they are the people that prove the rule, right? Now, equally, 100-80-100 as a formula applies whether you're working 5 days, 4 days, 3 days, 2 days, or 1 day. It is 80% of the time that you work, you get paid for the day, but you work 80% of that time. That's the thesis. Now, if you want to work more, you get paid more. If you want to work 3 days, we're having to adjust it, because what we're saying is it's about output, and we see the evidence very clear that the output goes up. So I don't care if I'm paying more, I'm getting the output that I'm looking for.
Right, good. So we're sort of looping back here towards those early questions, which were talking about productivity, and certainly for me that 100-80-100 is ingrained in my head now around that. As we're heading towards the close, I thought a couple of things. First of all, sort of if each speaker just wants to sort of sum up their sort of main thoughts or recommendations, and also we might run a sort of final poll, which is a sort of recapture of the very first poll we did. So, Jackie, do you want to sort of lead the sort of roundup at the end?
Sure. I suppose my last point to that, and maybe it's a controversial point, is that have you actually got the right people in your business? So if you're talking about, lack of motivation, or how do we measure productivity outputs, and, if you've got people that are engaged and interested and loyal, like 2 days, 3 days, 5 days, if they're there and you've got a good supportive network around them, they'll do great work. If you've got people that don't believe in what you stand for, who aren't interested in the work, you can still probably drop their days to 4 days, and they won't have the productivity output 4 days. So I think really thinking about who you've got in your teams, how you recruit, what you're looking for, again, is an important part to this puzzle, right? But from my angle, I just come back to that position of 4-day work is a tool, and it's really important as we navigate in this unknown that we look for the tools that are available. We know very clearly that people are saying flexibility, autonomy, balance, whatever balance means, that's important to them. We know that. We also know that businesses are struggling. There is a lack of people out there. You want to retain the people you've got. So looking at tools is smart, but how you implement that, how you experiment with them, how you get the feedback from your people, that is where I think the success will be. Collaborating, doing it together.
You sort of put a bomb under the whole thing there, and we could have carried on for another few hours with the first comment you made. So thank you for that. So Ellen, sort of final thoughts from you, please.
Yeah, sure. I just I think that the idea of #WorkSchoolHours, which has a lot of similarities with 4-day week, it's really about how do we increase productivity, how do we increase staff wellbeing, how do we increase retention of staff, and it's by looking at doing things a little bit differently in terms of the way we structure work. And for me, my core idea is how do we make it better for parents in a way that's good for everybody. The second thing I'd just like to say is, and John, I hope you're happy to share this, I wrote an article which was published last week about the leadership and teamwork lessons learned out of the Afghan evacuation task. So my team and I as volunteers, we evacuated several hundred people from Afghanistan, and I wrote this article about the leadership lessons learned, and I think we've actually covered so much of it today. So yeah, as Jackie said, the hours of work are just one tool, but there's so much more to leadership than just that. And also, if you want to chat about any of this more, you can check out my website. Sorry, blatant pitch, ellenjoannelson.com. Thanks.
Thanks very much. We've just got a minute left. But Andrew, we've got the results of the final poll. Now we have 27% people saying yes, 24% saying no, and we've got almost 49% of people saying maybe. So we've definitely got an increase in people saying yes. What's your reaction to that?
Well, here's the thing, right? I didn't expect to be a campaigner for the 4-day week. I was trying to answer a different question. But over the last 4 years, thousands of companies around the world have reached out, and whenever polls are conducted globally, 80% of employees when asked said they want to work less. Right? So this is not the train we expected. It's not going the way we thought it was going to go. We were expecting something else, but you are quite simply faced with a choice as a leader now. You either get on this or you're going to be running down the track after it. The biggest risk you have is not whether you introduce this. Your biggest risk is whether your biggest competitor does it first. And if they do, try and work out how you are going to attract, retain staff in the future.
Thanks very much, Andrew. Thanks very much, Jackie and Ellen, for your contributions too. It's been a fascinating discussion to listen to. In terms of what to from here, all those that have attended, you will have a link to collect the resources from today, which will be, in terms of slides that we've used. You'll also get a link to the new podcast series by the EMA called The Dynamic Workplace, where we look at a range of alternative working patterns. Where you will also get a link to a e-learning module that we've put about to help organisations navigate these changes. In terms of this webinar itself, we will email this out to you in 24 hours time. but we'd like to thank you all very much for joining, for participating in the questions. I'm sure this discussion will go on, and I know I've got 3 people in the room on the screen in front of me who will be very willing to engage in that debate and help us move it forward. So thank you all very much for joining us today, and that's the end of today's session. Thank you.
Thanks.